and it's really wonderful to be back here. Many fond memories. I didn't get to eat Krishna lunch because I procrastinated, so I finished the talk like 10 minutes ago, but another day. And yeah, as Anna so eloquently said, like I got my PhD in interdisciplinary ecology, and as a TCD student, like many of you guys, I had really wanted to work internationally after graduating, but those plans fell through, and so I ended up being the conservation social scientist for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, and I kind of want to split this talk up in two parts a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about FWC because I don't know, like it seems a little, a lot of you work in like exotic, faraway locations. So I wasn't sure how much people know about FWC and what we do. And then I want to talk a little bit about the actual social science research that I do. Also, I tend to babble a lot. So can somebody give me a sign when I'm at 15 minutes so that I kind of know? Thank you. And so who here has had any interactions with FWC, with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission? Bought a fishing license or something? It's cool. And I just wanted, because maybe not everybody knows, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission is the state government agency that manages fish and wildlife resources and their habitats in Florida under the public trust doctrine. And I don't want to get into that too much, but it's kind of the North American model of wildlife management, which views wildlife as being held in the public trust. So it's government agencies like FWC that make rules and regulation that regulate fish and wildlife. So they are not under private ownership for the most part. There's kind of a principle of democracy in terms of who has access to these resources and can use them. Wildlife markets are very, very limited, or in the case of fisheries, just heavily regulated. So this agency that I work for makes the rules, enforces the rules. We also manage bunches of public lands, promote boating safety and hunter safety and all those things. And our mission is to manage fish and wildlife resources for their long-term well-being and the benefit. And so this is kind of the organizational chart of the Fish and Wildlife Commission, and the decision makers are at the very top. They are these 7 commissioners who are appointed by the governor for 5-year terms. There are no term limits, and the rest of the agency can kind of be split up into like 3 parts. We have the law enforcement side. There are several divisions for resource management, like freshwater fisheries management, marine fisheries management, hunting game management. And then on the right side here, we have the Fish and Wildlife Research Institute, which is the research arm, which provides the scientific information that helps the commissioners make decisions. And within the research arm, at the very bottom, we have the Center for Conservation Social Science, which is kind of a big deal because as in conservation biology, in natural resource management, for a long time, the focus has been on understanding the natural resources, understanding abundance of fish and wildlife, understanding their biology. But increasingly, and TCD has known this for a long time, people are part of the picture. We are in nature, we're interacting with nature, some of us are taking some of nature, and for fish and wildlife management agencies, people have often, or the focus has been on natural resource users, specifically hunters and fishers. But there's also increasing awareness that we need to communicate, engage with diverse audiences, like people who like to watch wildlife, bird watchers, or understand the barriers to access to natural resources. And that's important for us as an agency to stay relevant as maybe interest in hunting decreases in the general population. Fishing is still very popular in Florida, so we don't really have to worry about there being a lack of interest. So to this end, to better understand people and work on the human dimensions, the Center for Conservation Social Science Research was founded in 2018, actually few years before that, I think 2015, the first social scientist was hired at FWC. Her name was Nia Morales, and she is on this, you can't see her, but she's here, and she's amazing. And so she was the N of one, the sole social scientist for a few years, which is still the case for many wildlife management agencies across the nation. They have like one social scientist. So we're pretty lucky in Florida to have this larger group of people, including my boss, who is silly and lets me use a silly picture of her. That's Chelsea Crandall, and my lovely coworkers. And so we are kind of the hub for social science integration at FWC. The center works with divisions across the agency to provide social science information that generally like people request, and do surveys, do studies to provide that information. And then in about 2.5, 3 years ago, it was decided to hire a person to be a specifically regionally embedded social scientist for the Florida Keys. And that is me. And so that's the first time that a social scientist, instead of being like at this hub and like providing social science services as requested, needed to be embedded within a biological research lab. So we kind of know about the value and contributions that conservation social science makes when it's included in conservation work. So this Bennett paper from 2017 points out that it facilitates learning about and knowledge of conservation challenges. It allows for the imagination, innovation, and creation of novel or desirable concept practices or models for conservation, and that it improves conservation management practices and governance processes. So it's really, it sounds great, but is it easy? This paper from the previous year kind of also points to the barriers of integrating social science. And a lot of that is institutional, like the existing cultures are maybe focused more on biological research, maybe catering to the stakeholder groups that we've catered to for a long time, knowledge of gaps or differences in how people have been trained, right? Like TCD has been doing interdisciplinary work for decades. Is it decades now? Yeah. And at FWC, a lot of people will sometimes ask me, wait, what's interdisciplinary? How do you do that? And that's great. People are curious, but there are these kind of just barriers to fostering integration. So I had all of that in mind as I was sent down to the Florida Keys to be the conservation social scientist there. Who here has been to the Florida Keys? Did you like it? So it's a string of islands at the southern end of the state of Florida, and it's kind of beautiful. There are still some coral reefs left. People go scuba diving. Boating is very popular. Sometimes the water is crystal green and beautiful. Big sport fishing activity, like thousands of people come down to sport fish. Lobstering is very popular during the lobstering season. And there's also vibrant, pretty important commercial fishery, a trap-based fishery for lobster and crabs, stone crabs. And yeah, so pretty exciting to work with like interesting, diverse resource users, and also to work with all these people who work at the South Florida Regional Lab, who are biologists who like study lobster, who go diving and snorkeling, and they count sponges and do restoration work and scrape weird yucky stuff off these things they call bioballs. And yeah, so I was really excited to go down and meet them. But I wasn't really sure what does that actually mean to integrate conservation social science in a lab like that. Like, what do my future colleagues, like, what do they know about social science? What are they expecting from me? What issues are they concerned about? I didn't know. And do they think social science can help them? And as a qualitative leaning social scientist, if you have questions from people, like, what do you do? you kind of ask them. So you get it. So I made myself an interview guide that addressed those questions that I had. And I did 14 semi-structured interviews of about 1 hour each with a bunch of people from the lab. I made sure I got the leader of each of the different research groups. There's a lobster team, a finfish team, and then at least one team member, more junior or more senior, like try to get like a good representation of people there. Used auto transcription for all the interviews, coded everything in vivo, and did a thematic analysis. And so here are like some snippets of results of what I found. Then I asked them, hey, like I'm coming down here to be a social scientist. Like, what can I do? How can I help you? Like, what do you want to do? They were like, yay, outreach. Everybody was really happy to see me. Everybody was really excited that I would go and communicate with the people for them. So things that they mentioned was science communication, outreach, better outreach materials, and building relationships. There was a real strong desire for the social scientists to go out and build relationships with people. They also had like some really good, can I get rid of them? Wait, actually I can, right? I use the mouse. I have actually used a computer before. Yeah, so there were also like more like classical, what you would understand as social science tasks, like get the perspectives of the public, like what do they want? Build trust with people. That was a huge topic, and yeah, so pretty good ideas that they had of what social science could and should do. I asked them what the conservation issues in the Florida Keys were, and you don't need to read like all these words. I just wanted to point out that they talked about the user pressure on resources, that there are large-scale problems and issues of interconnectedness, right? So they would talk about like coral decline and climate change, and then they talked about the challenges. What my take home from this was that a lot of these problems have a pretty strong people component. Like human dimensions are a pretty big part of these issues they identified. And when I asked them about the roadblocks to addressing conservation issues, they talked about the structural problems. They talked about the distrust. They talked that the public just doesn't know. They don't know the regulations and attitudes. Again, like people seem to be a big part of that. So a lot of the problems seem to be perceived as being people driven. And finally, when I asked them what information needs existed, they really wanted to understand resource users. And again, they wanted to work on engagement. So just to summarize, I kind of found they thought social science was outreach, which is something I'm working on with them. They identified so many resource issues, and most of them have a strong human dimensions component. And people are kind of identified as the problem. So there was a little bit this hope, this expectation that can social science just go and fix the people problem? Which is interesting. Like to me, this internal assessment was just useful to understanding the expectations, the misconceptions, and the information that people have. And it also showed me that really a lot of these barriers that the Bennett paper had identified I was probably going to encounter some of that in my work there. And that addressing these institutional and internal barriers was probably going to be really important to addressing the larger scale problems. Like they had identified also like structural issues in how to address conservation issues. And yeah, there was a little bit of a, they talked about these big problems like structural problems, interconnectedness, these kind of big wicked problems that we talk about in TCD a lot. A lot of these, the people I talk to work on very small scale issues, right? They want to understand how lobster communicates through their pee. They're literally people who are obsessed with lobster pee. Or, how to grow sponges for restoration, which is great. But there was this sense of hopelessness that, yeah, we can do our research, but there's really no way to address the underlying problems, which, yeah, that was just interesting to know that. And I guess like for me, a big take home was that I had to manage this expectation that like one social scientist alone will just fix the problem and they can continue studying the lobster P. Casey, I love you if you ever see this. She loves the lobster P. So yeah, so that was this project. This was kind of how I was situated as a social scientist at this lab. I then had, like, as one of my first projects there, I was part of a very big effort to study the efficacy of a spatial fishing closure at Western Dry Rocks. Western Dry Rocks is this kind of like square mile of water, stuff with some rocks sticking out, west of Key West. It's a really popular fishing spot. Fish aggregate there during spawning. And because it's a spawning aggregation, there has been like a push to close it to fishing during certain months. And when that closure was implemented, they said, okay, like we'll close it for 7 years, and you do all of this research to figure out if it's effective. And so a lot of effort is made with hydrophones and counting fish, lots of diving to assess the changes to the reproductive output from Western Dry Rocks, characterizing the changes in abundance and behavior of the fish and all that. But also they included some social science and some assessment of human dimensions. So I did this tiny little part over here doing social science interviews for this work in this little blue square. So I made myself an interview guide again. First, make an interview guide. And what people were interested in is they wanted to know, are people aware that the closure exists? So we started this kind of like the first year. This was like the baseline study, first year of the closure. Do people know it exists? What do they think about it? What do they think about the process by which the closure was established? Because we knew it was controversial, and there were some people who were not so fond of it, especially fishing guides who take customers there to go fishing, because it's relatively close to the US, so accessible with fishing season. And then understand the impacts of closure. I did 18 semi-structured interviews, oodles of minutes of recorded interviews. We talked to some charter captains and commercial fishers, and then I had this like larger group of like other users and interested parties. And this was largely driven by just the perception that especially the charter captain commercial fishers, like that's where like a lot of the conflict had come from. So people wanted to understand where that came from. Yeah. So I'll just give like a couple of a lot of stuff came out of this, but the support and opposition to the closure did fall out kind of along user group lines. So people who were direct users, the commercial fishers, and the charter captains tended to be against it. They saw it as political special interests had driven the closure, and it was perceived as being ineffective. They thought, they posited that people would just go elsewhere to other less known spawning aggregations and fish there. And yeah, and yeah, there were like pretty harsh kind of statements about how unfair the process had been. And those who supported the closure, which was more like the NGOs, member of the public, people who just fish for sport, like on their own, had more hopes that it would improve the fishery and have ecosystem benefits. People who scuba dive, because the area is still open for diving, thought it was very nice because it would reduce conflicts, right? Because when the people who fish are not allowed to be there, then the scuba divers can be there, and so then they don't have conflicts with like competing for the buoys where you hook your boats up and stuff. Both groups were concerned that there was not enough enforcement. There was like an issue with the buoys. It took a long time for the buoys to get installed. Am I in 15 minutes? Yeah. Oh, perfect. This is going way better than I thought. Okay. So, yes. So one thing that really stood out to me was that I asked people about the process pretty late in the interview. It was like the third question. But when I started the interview and said like, hey, do you know about the season of fishing closure at Western Dry Rocks? And what do you know about it? We were expecting people to say like, here's these coordinates, it's closed from this month to this month. They were like, yeah, it's because they say there's a spawning aggregation there, and the flats fishers really wanted it, and they pushed it through. Or yeah, I work for this NGO, and we really saw how important the spawning aggregation was. So this was like a really important win for us. We get a lot of hope, like good responsive management. So the process was brought up right away by people, and it was so interesting to me that more than half of the interviewees mentioned that this process was driven by these light tackle fishers, like a group of fishers that fish more in the flats closer to shore, because there's a fish called a permit, which swims around there that they like to catch, which spawns at Western Dry Rocks. So if that doesn't get fished, they think like the permit will be more abundant. And BTT is the Bonefish and Tarpon Trust, which is an organization of flats fishers. So there was like more than half of people said, yes, this process was driven by BTT and these flats fishers and their interest. And of these people, half of them said, and that's a great thing. This is such a good example of good responsive management, meeting the needs of the fishing population. And then the other half of people said the same first part of the sentence, but then said, and it's really unfair. This is like special interests driving resource management. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. So we learned a bunch of things from the interviews. I wanted to take like all the stuff I just said, that there were like really mixed opinions on the process. Some thought it was really fair, others feeling like it was unfair. Somebody said it's a power grab by NOAA, which is like NOAA. I like distrust in government, distrust in management. So for me, what was interesting is we are part of this like big project. It's about assessing the efficacy of this closure. People are looking, is there more reproductive output? Are there more fish swimming around? And my results, like from a qualitative study, are more like, yeah, we have a loss in social capital potential. There are issues of distrust. And we know that that is so important, right? Like trust and leadership, social capital are important factors of successful natural resource management. But it was really hard to communicate that to, or in the context of this big project that was supposed to talk about like, well, is it effective or is it not effective? So that is kind of like something that makes my position really interesting in terms of bringing qualitative methods. This idea of interdisciplinarity and integrating social science into some of these processes, very interesting, because in trying to integrate social science into research and eventually management, it's not just doing projects. It's not just, oh, let's collect more and different data. It's really kind of about rethinking relationships and what matters. So I think I heard this here, and I don't know who to attribute this to, but I love this saying that like integrating social science or interdisciplinary work, it's not rocket science, right? It is harder. And I just love that. And that's all I had to say so far. It's been a real treat, and this is a key lime pie, and it's delicious, and you should all come down to the Florida Keys. Yeah.